Have you ever heard a story so dark, so well hidden, that when it finally comes to light it threatens to rewrite everything we thought we knew about history? This isn't a ghost story. This isn't folklore. This is something far worse. Because what happened at Moss Creek Plantation in Georgia during the 1840s and 1850s was real. And the woman at the center of it, Eleanor Cresswell, wasn't just a widow trying to survive. She was building something terrifying, something calculated, and something that would leave behind a trail of blood that Georgia's most powerful families tried to erase for over a century. Tonight, we begin with the discovery that set everything in motion. The Charleston broker. In April of 1857, a traveling cotton broker from Charleston, South Carolina, sat in the dimly lit study of a modest plantation called Moss Creek. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just reviewing sales records, columns of names, dates, prices. Ordinary paperwork. But as he traced the lines with his finger, he noticed a strange pattern. Over the past 15 years, Moss Creek had sold 23 young male slaves. That in itself wasn't unusual. What was strange was the consistency. Every one of those men had been sold for a price far higher than the market average. And next to each entry, in careful handwriting, were 3 words that made the broker's stomach tighten. Prime condition certified. It looked innocent enough, maybe even like a marketing trick. But years later, on his deathbed, the broker would confess that the moment he saw those words, something inside him knew he had stumbled onto a secret he wasn't supposed to see. Moss Creek Plantation. Moss Creek wasn't one of those famous southern estates with marble steps and white columns. It was small, 370 acres of Georgia clay, tucked between the Oconee River and the county road running from Milledgeville to Augusta. The main house was plain, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber. Around it stood a cotton gin, a barn, a smokehouse, and 12 cabins for the enslaved workers. Nothing about it suggested wealth or grandeur. In fact, neighbors often remarked that Moss Creek's barn seemed far too large for such a modest plantation. But despite its humble appearance, Moss Creek was unusually profitable. Its owner, Eleanor Cresswell, had turned the struggling farm into a steady machine of wealth. And she had done it in a way no one else dared. The widow of Moss Creek. Eleanor inherited Moss Creek in 1840 when her husband, Thomas, died suddenly of what the doctor called apoplexy. She was only 31 years old, childless, and neighbors expected her to sell the land and return to Savannah, where her family owned a shipping business. But Eleanor didn't leave. Instead, she fired her husband's overseer, took charge herself, and within a year doubled the plantation's profits. How? By treating people as if they were investments. While most planters held on to enslaved families for generations, Eleanor bought only young, strong men, between 18 and 25. She kept them for about a year, sometimes less, fattened them up, and sold them to planters farther west, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. The women at Moss Creek, never more than 6 or 7 at a time, were all older, past childbearing age. Eleanor had no interest in raising children on her land. Families, she said, were inefficient. Her neighbors whispered about her coldness. She never attended church. She never remarried. She never hosted parties like other widows of standing. And when anyone asked why she lived that way, she would give the same answer with a thin smile that never touched her eyes. Widowhood has freed me from the burden of pretense. The 3 ledgers. What no one knew was that Eleanor kept 3 separate sets of books. The first looked ordinary: plantation expenses, cotton yields, sales. That was the version she showed to neighbors and tax collectors. The second, kept hidden but not too carefully, contained the real profits. Numbers far higher than the first ledger. The third, no one was supposed to see. It was locked in an iron box under the floorboards of her bedroom. Written in a private code, it documented everything. Names, dates, physical descriptions of every man she bought and sold. And then something more chilling. Detailed notes about their bodies. Eye color, hair texture, the exact shade of their skin under candlelight, the shape of a nose, the line of a jaw. She wasn't just recording property. She was building a catalog, a genealogical map. A weapon. Whispers in the dark. The enslaved workers at Moss Creek understood enough to be afraid. When Eleanor bought a new man, she kept him isolated for a week. On the 7th night, she summoned him to the main house. The women who worked inside noticed patterns. Eleanor always bathed before these meetings. She always wore the same plain gray dress. She always kept her bedroom lamp burning until well past midnight. The next morning, the young man would walk differently. Shoulders slumped, eyes lowered, like someone carrying a weight too heavy to name. And Eleanor would spend the entire following day in her study, writing furiously in her coded ledger. The first disappearances. In 1843, Eleanor sold a man named Samuel to a planter in Alabama for an astonishing $1,800. But Samuel never arrived. The buyer demanded answers. Eleanor sent copies of the bill of sale, a signed receipt from the driver who had supposedly delivered Samuel, and a letter of polite concern. The planter assumed Samuel had run away. After all, enslaved men fled all the time. Case closed. But 6 months later, another buyer reported the same problem. Then another. By 1847, 5 men from Moss Creek had vanished on their journeys west. The pattern should have been obvious. But it wasn't. The buyers lived hundreds of miles apart, communication was slow, and Eleanor's paperwork was always flawless. To the outside world, she was an honest businesswoman. To those who looked closer, if anyone had dared, she was hiding something monstrous. The truth beneath the soil. The men hadn't run away. None of them ever left Georgia. Their bodies lay in unmarked graves on Moss Creek property, in a rocky patch of land Eleanor claimed she was saving for an orchard. She forbade her workers from plowing there. The soil's no good for cotton, she said. But the soil was good for something else, hiding the dead. The barn. Every disappearance followed the same ritual. 3 nights before a man was scheduled to be transported, Eleanor summoned him to the barn. Inside the oversized structure was a locked room at the back. She greeted him with kindness. Offered him whiskey, a reward, before the long journey. But the whiskey was laced with laudanum. Just enough to make him weak, not unconscious. She wanted him awake, because she had something to show him. She would open the iron box, lay the ledger before him, and explain. Calmly, coldly, she would point to the descriptions, the catalog of faces and features, and tell him what it meant. That she was documenting bloodlines. That she was building a weapon out of truth. That one day, her records would expose the deepest, ugliest secrets of Georgia's most powerful families. And then, as the drug took hold and the man's world blurred at the edges, Eleanor would begin. Fire-ending tease. The broker in 1857 only saw the surface. What Eleanor Cresswell was truly doing at Moss Creek would not come to light until much later. But, the bodies were already in the ground, and her coded ledger was already filling with names, faces, and secrets that the South could never afford to let the world know. This was only the beginning. Right finger in Part 2, we'll look deeper into Eleanor's private rituals, the ledger itself, and why the phrase, prime condition certified, struck such terror when its meaning was finally uncovered. Do you want me to continue Part 2 in the same style, around 1,000 words, suspense-driven, written like a YouTube narration, or would you like me to first outline all 10 parts so you know the full arc before diving in? Part 2. The Sun in the Shadows. Studio microphone, opening hook. What's more terrifying than a secret? A secret that doesn't die with one person, but is carried on by blood, by family, by someone waiting in the shadows to finish the work that was started. Because Eleanor Cresswell wasn't alone. Moss Creek wasn't just her project. And the truth is, the one who shared her mission, the one who walked out of the shadows of the barn to help her bury those bodies, was her son. A son who, according to every church registry, every census record, every piece of public history, didn't exist. The hidden son. Henry Cresswell was a ghost in plain sight. Officially, Eleanor had no children. No births, no christenings, no records. A respectable widow, childless. That's what neighbors believed. But the truth was far darker. Eleanor had given birth years before her marriage, back in 1829, when she was just 20 years old. The father was someone her family could never acknowledge, a man who worked on the Savannah docks. He was enslaved, hired out to load ships. Intelligent, dignified, and dangerous in the eyes of white society. Eleanor's attraction to him had been reckless, forbidden. And when her pregnancy became impossible to hide, her family acted fast. The man was sold south, to the cane fields of Louisiana, a death sentence. Eleanor never saw him again. Through whispers, she learned he was dead by 1835. Worked until his body gave out, buried in an unmarked grave. That knowledge hardened her heart into something cold and sharp. Her child, little Henry, was sent north before his first birthday. He was raised in Philadelphia by Eleanor's widowed aunt, under the name Henry Lowell. To the world, he was simply a merchant's adopted son. But Henry always knew the truth, who his real mother was, and what had been done to his father. Henry returns. In 1841, after Thomas Cresswell's sudden death, Henry came back to Georgia. Not as Eleanor's son, of course. To neighbors, he was Henry Lowell, a traveling farm equipment salesman from Philadelphia. Respectable, charming, with legitimate business papers. He stayed in boarding houses, made rounds in Milledgeville and Augusta, and every so often, paid a business visit to Moss Creek. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But behind closed doors, Henry was not a visitor, he was family. He had a room of his own in the main house. And at night, while the rest of Moss Creek slept, he and Eleanor would spread the coded ledger across the desk and whisper their plans. No one suspected the truth. No one guessed that the unusually large barn on the property had a secret. A trapdoor beneath the hay. A hidden cellar where certain tools were kept, where the darkest tasks of Moss Creek were completed. The selection. Eleanor didn't choose her victims randomly. She hunted them. At slave markets in Savannah, Augusta, and Milledgeville, she studied young men the way horse breeders studied bloodlines. But she wasn't looking at muscle or teeth. She was looking at faces. Why? Because Eleanor had spent years studying Georgia's most powerful families. She knew their secrets, especially the ones they wanted buried. The Rutledge nose. The Caldwell eyes. The Pemberton jawline. Traits that shouldn't have appeared in enslaved men, unless those pure families had crossed the line they claimed was unthinkable. And of course, they had. Everyone knew, in whispers, that powerful men fathered children with enslaved women. That some of those children were hidden, others sold off, and a few lived double lives under strict silence. Eleanor was collecting proof of that hypocrisy. Living, breathing proof. The ritual. When Eleanor found a young man whose features matched those of a wealthy family, she bought him no matter the cost. She brought him to Moss Creek, kept him a year, and then came the ritual. First, the laudanum-laced whiskey in the locked room of the barn. Just enough to blur his thoughts, not enough to knock him out. She wanted him awake. Then, the ledger. She showed him the coded notes, pointed out the features she had written down. Explained why he had been chosen. Explained what his face meant, not just to her, but to the men whose reputations she intended to destroy. And when his comprehension sank in, when his fear mixed with rage and despair, Henry would step out from the shadows. Together, mother and son recorded final details, measurements, markings, every physical trait that might one day be compared to a wealthy Georgian's legitimate heir. And then they made sure the man would never leave Moss Creek alive. Dead evidence. Eleanor understood something chilling. Living proof could be silenced, could run, could lie. Dead proof could not. The bodies were buried in the rocky section of land she claimed she was saving for an orchard. No one plowed there, no one asked questions. Beneath that soil, unmarked graves filled steadily year after year. By 1850, 13 young men lay beneath Moss Creek. 13 names in the coded ledger. 13 secrets waiting to explode. Eleanor wasn't planning to take them to court. She knew no Southern jury would side with her. No, her plan was more devastating. She would use shame like a weapon. She would strip away the lies of Georgia's proudest families, prove that their bloodlines were not pure, prove that the system they built rested on a hypocrisy they could never deny. And when the time came, those graves would be her evidence. The changing South. But history was moving faster than Eleanor had planned. By the 1850s, the country was splitting apart. The Compromise of 1850 had calmed things for a while, but everyone could feel it, the storm was coming. North against South. free against slave. And Eleanor began to wonder, would the war erupt before she revealed her evidence? Would everything she'd built be buried forever in the chaos? Then, in the summer of 1856, fate knocked on her door. The letter. A letter arrived at Moss Creek. Addressed to Widow Cresswell, signed by a man named Daniel Harrington. He was a lawyer in Boston, he claimed, and a correspondent for the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator. The letter was polite, but its message was sharp. He had heard rumors. Strange irregularities about her plantation. Unusual turnover in her enslaved workforce. Men who were sold and then disappeared. He was planning to travel through Georgia that September. And he hoped to visit Moss Creek to discuss the matter in person. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Her face calm, her hands steady. Then she called for Henry. When he read it, the resemblance to his father showed in his expression, quiet strength, mixed with fear. "Do we stop?" he asked. Eleanor closed the iron box, slid it back beneath the floorboards, and shook her head. "No," she whispered. "We move faster. Fire-ending tease." Daniel Harrington was coming south. And he had questions Eleanor could not afford to let him ask. Right finger in part 3, we'll follow Harrington's journey into Georgia, and see how close he came to uncovering the nightmare buried beneath Moss Creek Plantation. Part 3. The Boston Lawyer. Studio microphone opening hook. What would you do if you walked into someone's home, someone polite, calm, and perfectly respectable on the surface, yet you knew in your bones that they were hiding something terrible? That was the situation Daniel Harrington faced in the fall of 1856 when he rode through the gates of Moss Creek Plantation. He thought he was investigating rumors. What he didn't realize was that he was stepping into the lair of a woman who had been preparing for this very moment for years. And once Eleanor Cresswell decided you were a threat, she made sure you never walked away unchanged. The visitor from Boston. Daniel Harrington wasn't a wealthy gentleman abolitionist writing essays from a comfortable parlor in Massachusetts. He was a working lawyer. 42 years old, thin, pale, with ink-stained fingers and a worn suit too heavy for Georgia's heat. When his carriage pulled up to Moss Creek on September 15, 1856, Eleanor watched from the porch. She saw the details instantly: the frayed collar, the wrong cut of cloth, the awkward way he carried himself in the southern sun. A northerner. A man with questions. A man who, if handled wrong, could bring everything crashing down. She greeted him in the parlor, a room designed for appearances. Neat, modest, nothing grand. Nothing that would betray the hidden profits buried in her ledgers. She poured him water, folded her hands in her lap, and let him speak. The first confrontation. "Mrs. Cresswell," Harrington began, his Boston accent sharp against the slow Georgia air, "I'll be direct. I've received reports that your plantation operates under unusual circumstances. That you purchase only men. That you sell them after short periods of time. And that several never arrive at their destinations." Eleanor met his gaze without a flicker. "You've been misinformed," she said coolly. "I keep a few women for domestic tasks. The men, yes, I sell after a year or two. But that's just business. If some choose to escape along the way, well, that is the nature of slavery, is it not?" Harrington leaned forward, pulling a notebook from his pocket. "I have 5 documented cases of disappearances. 5 men, sold by you, never arriving. In 12 years. That's more than coincidence, Mrs. Cresswell. That's a pattern." Eleanor's lips curved into her tight smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "It seems to me," she replied, "that a lawyer from Boston is seeing what he wants to see. You came here hoping to find cruelty, some scandal to parade before your abolitionist friends. But all you'll find is a competent widow running a legal plantation." Harrington's jaw tightened. "Then you won't mind if I stay nearby. Speak with your neighbors. Perhaps interview some of your slaves. You're welcome to waste your time as you please," Eleanor said smoothly. "But Georgia isn't Boston, Mr. Harrington. People here protect their own. Outsiders asking questions are rarely appreciated." It wasn't a threat, but it was a warning. And Harrington heard it, the whisper in the dark. For the next 3 days, Harrington stayed in a boarding house in Milledgeville, asking quiet questions. Merchants, Doctors, neighbors, everyone told him the same thing. Eleanor Cresswell was strange, yes. Independent, yes. But honest, efficient, even admirable. Then, on the fourth night, as he sat at his desk reviewing notes, a knock came at his door. An elderly black woman stood outside, glancing nervously down the hallway. Her name was Ruth. She was one of the house slaves at Moss Creek. She had worked there since before Thomas Cresswell's death. And she had something to say. Once inside, in hushed tones, Ruth told him what she had seen. The young men, bought and sold. The seventh night in the main house. The endless hours Eleanor spent writing in her locked study. The barn, and the sounds that came from it late at night. She ain't right, Ruth whispered, her hands twisting together. Been wrong a long time. And them men, they don't all get sold like she says. Some vanish. And the ground, there's a patch she don't let nobody work. She say orchard, but it's been dug up too many times. Harrington's pulse quickened. Do you know what happens to them? Ruth shook her head. Nobody says it out loud. But I seen her. And that man. Harrington froze. What man? The equipment man. Mr. Lowell, she calls him. He come by often, stays days at a time. But I don't see no new tools. I see them two whispering, looking at books. Planning. Her eyes darted toward the door. I shouldn't have come. If she finds out, I don't know what she'll do. But someone need to know. Something evil at Moss Creek, Mr. Harrington. Evil that needs stopping. And with that, Ruth slipped back into the night, leaving Harrington alone with the echo of her words. The return to Moss Creek. By morning, Harrington had made his decision. Rumors were not enough. He needed proof. Without sending word ahead, he saddled a horse and rode to Moss Creek. When he arrived, Eleanor was outside, supervising the loading of cotton bales. She turned at the sound of his approach, her face smooth, unreadable. Mr. Harrington, she said evenly. Back so soon? I thought you'd have finished your investigation by now. I'd like to see your property, Harrington replied. All of it, the outbuildings included. Something flickered in her eyes, not fear, but calculation. Then her smile returned. Of course, though I doubt you'll find anything of interest. The tour. Eleanor walked him through Moss Creek as if she had nothing to hide. The cotton gin, the smokehouse, the slave cabins, everything in its place, clean, orderly, unremarkable. Finally, they reached the barn. The structure loomed larger than any other building on the property. Eleanor swung open the main doors, revealing rows of tools, stacks of hay, and stalls for the mules. Harrington's eyes drifted to the rear. A door, heavy, closed. And the back room, he asked. Storage, Eleanor said smoothly. Old tools, broken equipment, I'd like to see it. For the first time, her composure faltered. Just for a breath, a flash of something in her expression, decision weighing against risk. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket. Very well, she said. And with that, Eleanor produced a key. Fire-ending tease. What lay behind that locked door would change everything Daniel Harrington thought he knew about Moss Creek. And once the door opened, there would be no turning back. Right finger in part 4, we'll step inside the barn, uncover the secrets hidden in its shadows, and see just how far Eleanor and Henry were willing to go to keep the truth buried. Part 4. The door in the barn. Studio microphone opening hook. Have you ever stood in front of a locked door and felt, deep in your bones, that whatever was behind it was not meant for you? That's where Daniel Harrington found himself at Moss Creek Plantation in the fall of 1856. He had come looking for answers, for evidence of cruelty. And now, Eleanor Cresswell was holding out a key. What he didn't realize was this: once that door opened, he wasn't just an investigator anymore. He was a witness. And at Moss Creek, witnesses rarely lived long. The key turns. The barn was heavy with the smell of hay and animal sweat. Dust floated in golden beams of light cutting through cracks in the wood. At the back, the small iron key glinted in Eleanor's hand. Storage, she said again, her tone flat, calm. Nothing you'll find interesting. But when the lock clicked and the door creaked open, Harrington felt a chill slide down his spine. The room was narrow, windowless. The air was different, stale, heavy, as if it hadn't been opened in weeks. Old farm tools leaned against the wall, but neatly arranged, too neatly. Coils of rope, a workbench scarred with cuts and burns. A dark stain on the floor that straw didn't fully hide. Eleanor stood behind him, her voice soft, almost teasing. "See, nothing unusual. Are you satisfied, Mr. Harrington?" Harrington crouched, fingertips brushing the rough floorboards. The stain was sticky at its edges, fresher than he expected. He glanced back, meeting Eleanor's calm gray eyes. Something inside him whispered, "She knows you know." Seeds of doubt. That night, Harrington returned to his boarding house, his notebook heavy with hurried sketches and notes. Tools, ropes, stains. Not proof, not yet. But something was there. He thought about Ruth's warning, the ground dug up, the vanished men, the mysterious Mr. Lowell. He thought about Eleanor's perfect answers, her unshakable composure. She was too prepared, too rehearsed. And if she was rehearsed, that meant she knew this day might come. For the first time, Harrington wondered if he was the one being investigated. Moss Creek after dark. Determined to see more, Harrington made a reckless choice. The next night, under the cover of darkness, he slipped from his boarding house, saddled his horse, and rode back to Moss Creek. The plantation was silent, lanterns extinguished, the cabins dark. He tethered his horse in the woods and crept through the fields, the Georgia night thick with crickets. The barn loomed ahead, a black shape against the stars. Inside, faint light flickered through the cracks. Someone was awake. Moving closer, Harrington peered through a gap in the boards. What he saw made his breath catch. The ritual. Eleanor stood in her gray dress, plain and severe. On the workbench lay her iron box, open, its coated ledger spread before her. And from the shadows stepped a man Harrington had never seen before. Tall, dark-skinned, his features refined, his presence commanding. Mr. Lowell, the equipment man. Eleanor spoke softly, her words carrying just enough for Harrington to catch fragments. Measurements, names, families. She was pointing to sketches in the ledger, comparing them to the young man seated in the center of the room, barefoot, his eyes heavy with drugged stupor, his wrists bound. Harrington's stomach twisted. This was no ordinary bookkeeping. This was evidence. Genealogies. Bloodlines. She was documenting features like a scientist studying specimens. The bound man muttered, tried to lift his head. Henry Lowell stepped forward, steadying him, holding him in place. Eleanor bent close, studying the curve of his nose, the color of his eyes, the angle of his jaw. Then she began to write. Line after line, detail after detail. Harrington realized he was watching the ritual Ruth had described. The ritual of the seventh night. A deadly audience. As Harrington stared, heart pounding, he felt the wood creak beneath his boot. The sound was soft, but inside the barn, Eleanor froze. Her head turned slightly. Her eyes, sharp as knives, scanned the shadows. For a terrifying moment, Harrington thought she had seen him. But then she returned to her work, dipping her quill into the inkwell. Henry, however, did not return to the ledger. Slowly, deliberately, his gaze slid toward the barn wall, toward the very crack where Harrington crouched. Their eyes met. Harrington stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. By the time he steadied himself and dared another glance, Henry was gone from sight. The warning. The next morning, Harrington sat stiffly at the breakfast table of his boarding house. Every sound in the street outside made him jump. Every knock at the door set his nerves on edge. When the innkeeper brought the mail, one envelope bore no name, no seal. Just a folded sheet inside. The note read, "Leave, while you can." No signature. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Elegant. Feminine. Eleanor. The net tightens. Harrington faced a choice. He had enough to fuel suspicion. Ruth's testimony, his own observations, the letter. But it wasn't evidence. Not the kind that could hold in court. And yet, could he risk staying longer? Eleanor wasn't trying to convince him anymore. She was warning him, which meant she had already decided what to do with him if he ignored her. But Harrington was stubborn. He had come for the truth, and leaving without it wasn't an option. That evening, he wrote to his contacts in Boston, describing what he had seen, sealing the letters carefully. If something happened to him, at least his suspicions would travel north. But Eleanor and Henry had been playing this game far longer than Harrington. And they were already preparing their next move. Back at Moss Creek. At Moss Creek, Eleanor closed her ledger and handed it to Henry. Her son placed it carefully in the iron box and slid the box back into its hiding place. "Do you think he saw enough?" Henry asked quietly. "Enough to be dangerous," Eleanor replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were cold. "He won't stop now. Men like him never do." Henry frowned. "Then what do we do?" Eleanor's thin smile curved. "We give him what he's looking for. Let him think he's discovered something. And when he's in too deep to retreat." She paused, glancing toward the orchard land, the graves beneath the soil. "We make sure he joins the others." Fire-ending tease. Daniel Harrington thought he was closing in on the truth of Moss Creek. But the truth was already closing in on him. Right finger in Part 5, we'll follow Harrington as he pushes deeper into the mystery, unaware that Eleanor and Henry are already planning the trap that could turn him from investigator into victim. Would you like me to keep writing Part 5 next, or pause here so I can map out the 10-part arc for you so you know where the story is heading before I keep spinning the suspense? Part 5. The Trap. Studio microphone opening hook. What's worse than being hunted? Being hunted by people who never admit they're hunting you. That's exactly where Daniel Harrington found himself in the fall of 1856. He thought he was circling closer to the secrets of Moss Creek Plantation. But in truth, Eleanor Cresswell and her hidden son Henry were circling him. And if he didn't realize it soon enough, his investigation would end the same way as the men buried in Eleanor's orchard, silent, hidden, and forgotten. The Whispering Orchard. The morning sun poured over Moss Creek's fields as Harrington approached again, this time with a plan. He would demand another tour, this time, not just the barn. He wanted the orchard. Eleanor greeted him on the porch, her hands folded, expression unreadable. "Mr. Harrington, I must say, your persistence is remarkable." Harrington smiled thinly. "Persistence uncovers truth, Mrs. Cresswell. And I'd like to walk your orchard today. I hear it's a fine piece of land." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. A quick, silent measure of whether he already knew too much. Then, just as quickly, her smile returned. "Of course," she said. "The land isn't planted yet, but you may see it if you wish." The uneasy walk. They walked together. Across the fields. The soil grew rougher, patches of disturbed earth stretching out like scars. Harrington's lawyer's eye caught every detail: raised mounds, uneven dirt, places where grass refused to grow. Eleanor spoke as if reciting a script. "I intend to plant fruit trees here. An orchard will increase the plantation's value." But Harrington wasn't listening. He crouched at one mound, running his hand across the soil. It was loose, recently turned. Behind them, Henry appeared, carrying a hoe as if by coincidence. His expression was polite, his eyes anything but. "Ground's stubborn here," he said smoothly. "We've had to dig and turn it more than once." Eleanor added, "Henry has been assisting me with improvements. A very reliable man." The way she said it felt like a warning. Reliable, dependable, loyal. Harrington straightened, dusting soil from his fingers. His heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't prove what was beneath his feet, but he felt it. Bodies, secrets, and Eleanor knew he felt it. Ruth's desperation. That night, back at his boarding house, Harrington was startled by another visit. Ruth, the elderly slave from Moss Creek, slipped into his room once more. Her eyes were wild, her hands trembling. "You need to leave, sir. Please. I seen things I ain't supposed to see. Mrs. Eleanor, she's planning something. I heard her talking last night with that Henry man. They know about you. They mean to stop you." Harrington leaned forward. "Ruth, listen to me. If there are bodies buried in that orchard, if young men have been killed there, the world needs to know. Will you testify?" Ruth shook her head violently. "I can't. You don't understand. She's feared. She's clever. And Henry," her voice broke. "They'll kill me if they find out I'm here." Tears glistened in her eyes. But I couldn't keep quiet. Evil's walking at Moss Creek, and it won't stop. Not till someone stops her. Then she slipped back into the night, leaving Harrington with more urgency, and more fear, than ever before. The decoy. The following day, Harrington decided on a bold move. He requested to interview the slaves directly, in front of Eleanor. He knew they might not tell the truth, but he wanted to watch Eleanor's reaction. Eleanor agreed immediately, too quickly. She assembled half a dozen men and women in the yard. Harrington asked his questions carefully, about the barn, about the orchard, about the men who had disappeared. Every answer was the same. Polite, rehearsed, empty. Mrs. Cresswell treats us fair. Men get sold same as anywhere else. I don't know nothing about disappearances. Eleanor stood behind them the entire time, her expression calm, her presence oppressive. Harrington realized she had orchestrated every word. These weren't interviews. They were a performance. And he was the audience, being distracted while the real play unfolded somewhere else. The ledger's shadow. That night, Harrington returned to his room restless, unable to sleep. His mind spun on Ruth's warnings, the orchard's mounds, the barn's stains. But above all, he thought of the ledger. He had seen it, briefly, that night he spied through the barn wall. Names, measurements, families. If he could get that ledger, he'd have undeniable evidence. Not just rumor or suspicion, proof. And proof was what he needed to survive. The invitation. The next morning, a carriage arrived at the boarding house. The driver delivered a sealed note in elegant handwriting. Mr. Harrington, if you wish to resolve your suspicions, join me at Moss Creek this evening. I will show you what you truly wish to see. Come alone. E.C. Harrington read it twice, his blood running cold. This was it. Either the trap was sprung, or the truth would be revealed. Maybe both. Against every instinct of self-preservation, he prepared to go. The midnight barn. When Harrington arrived at Moss Creek under the cover of night, Eleanor herself greeted him. She carried a lantern, its glow sharp against the darkness. This way, she said softly, leading him not toward the house, but the barn. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and dust. Eleanor set the lantern on the workbench and unlocked the rear door again. Here, she said, her voice low. You've been searching for secrets. I'll give you one. She handed him the ledger. Harrington froze. The iron box was open, the ledger in her hands. Pages of names, features, measurements, sketches. It was everything Ruth had described, and more. Evidence of 13 men. Proof of something monstrous. He reached for it, his fingers trembling. Why are you showing me this? Eleanor's eyes glittered in the lamplight. Because I want you to understand before the end. Every page here is justice. Every page is vengeance against the men who built this empire of cruelty. Do you see, Mr. Harrington? I'm not the monster. They are. Before he could answer, a shadow moved behind him. Henry. Silent, towering, blocking the door. Harrington's stomach dropped. He had walked straight into the snare. Fire-ending tease. Daniel Harrington finally held the proof he had come for. But holding it and leaving Moss Creek alive were two very different things. Right finger in part 6, we'll step inside that midnight barn as Eleanor forces Harrington to choose, expose her secrets and risk becoming another body in the orchard, or join her in her mission of vengeance. Do you want me to continue with part 6 immediately, or would you like me to also sketch out how all 10 parts will unfold so you can see the full arc before I keep writing? Part 6. The choice. Studio microphone, opening hook. What would you do if you were handed proof of a crime so dark it could destroy an entire society, while standing face to face with the killer herself? That's exactly where Daniel Harrington found himself one humid September night inside the barn at Moss Creek Plantation. In one hand, he held Eleanor Cresswell's ledger, filled with evidence of disappearances and bloodlines. In the shadows behind him stood Henry, her secret son, blocking the only exit. The door was closed, the lantern burned low, and Daniel realized he had walked into the jaws of a trap. Eleanor's confession. Eleanor stepped closer, her gray cotton dress brushing against the dusty floorboards. You've chased rumors, Mr. Harrington, she said softly. But this is truth. Every page, every name, every feature recorded with care. These are not crimes. They are revelations. Harrington's throat was dry. 13 men are gone. Buried, I suspect, right outside this barn. You call it revelation, I call it murder. Eleanor tilted her head, as though humoring a stubborn child. Murder. No, murder is what happened to their fathers and mothers, worked to death in fields, beaten, sold, discarded. I give these men something greater. They become proof. Their bones will speak when words are denied. Their features will expose the hypocrisy of Georgia's proud families. Tell me, Mr. Harrington, is that not justice? Her words chilled him because part of him understood the rage behind them. But rage did not excuse blood. The pressure tightens. Henry stepped forward now, his shadow stretching long in the lantern light. His voice was calm but heavy. You've seen too much to walk away. You know that. Harrington gripped the ledger tighter. So what happens now? You kill me, bury me in that orchard, and pretend I never came. Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest smile. That depends on you. I have no interest in silencing you, Mr. Harrington. I have interest in recruiting you. The words hit harder than any threat. A terrible offer. Recruit me? Harrington asked, his voice sharp. Yes, Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming. You're a lawyer. You move among abolitionists, men and women who publish, who speak, who gather crowds. You could use this ledger not as evidence against me, but as evidence against the South. Together, we could bring down their names, their families, their false purity. Imagine, Mr. Harrington, entire bloodlines exposed for what they truly are. Henry added quietly, we don't need another enemy. We need someone who understands. Harrington's pulse hammered in his ears. They weren't simply killers. They were strategists. They believed their ritual, their deaths, were fuel for a larger war. But to join them meant betraying every oath he had ever sworn to justice. Harrington's defiance. He straightened his shoulders, forcing strength into his trembling voice. You think I'd ally with you? I came here to expose cruelty, not condone it. You talk of justice, but justice without mercy is only more cruelty. You don't want allies. You want accomplices. Henry's jaw tightened. Eleanor, however, only studied him, unblinking. Accomplice, ally, partner, she murmured. Names don't matter. What matters is survival. If you leave Moss Creek with that ledger, the families of documented will destroy you before you can destroy them. But if you stay with me, you might just survive. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Choose carefully, Mr. Harrington. My orchard is very forgiving to mistakes. Ruth in the shadows. Suddenly, the sound of shuffling feet echoed outside the barn. Harrington's heart leapt. Someone else was there. Eleanor snapped her head toward the door. Henry stepped forward, ready to intercept. But before he reached it, the barn door creaked open just an inch, and a sliver of candlelight slipped inside. Ruth's face appeared in the gap, her eyes wide with terror. Harrington nearly cried out in relief, but Eleanor moved faster than he thought possible. She snatched up the lantern and blew it out, plunging the barn into near darkness. Henry, she said in a voice sharp as glass, take care of it. Ruth's gasp cut through the night like a knife. Then the door slammed shut again. Silence followed, heavy, dreadful silence. Harrington's desperation. In the darkness, Harrington felt Eleanor's presence beside him, close enough to touch. You see, she whispered, loose tongues always end the same way. If you value your life, Mr. Harrington, decide now. His mind raced. He couldn't overpower Henry. He couldn't outrun Eleanor. His only weapon was the ledger clutched to his chest. But what good was paper if he never escaped the barn alive? The trap within the trap. A sound broke through the silence, boots returning, dragging weight across the ground. The door opened again, and lantern light flared back to life. Henry stood there, his sleeve smeared with dirt, his breathing heavy. At his feet lay Ruth's shawl, torn and muddied. Harrington's stomach turned. She had tried to help him, and now she was gone. Eleanor's voice was soft but merciless. The orchard will have another secret tonight. Unless, of course, you've reconsidered. The fracture. Something inside Harrington snapped. Grief, rage, Fear, all of it boiled together into reckless courage. "No," he said, his voice shaking but loud. "I won't join you. And I won't stay silent. Even if I die here, someone will know. Someone will come looking. You can't bury truth forever." Eleanor's smile finally faltered. For the first time, her icy calm cracked. Henry's eyes darkened. He reached for Harrington's arm. But Harrington acted first. With all his strength, he swung the ledger like a weapon, striking Henry across the face. Papers tore free, fluttering into the lantern's flame. Fire leapt instantly, racing across the dry hay stacked against the walls. The barn erupted with smoke and heat. Fire-ending tease. Harrington had set Moss Creek's darkest chamber ablaze, but in doing so, he may have trapped himself inside with Eleanor and Henry. Right finger in Part 7, the fire spreads, secrets burn, and the plantation itself begins to turn into a living tomb. But who will escape, and who will be buried with the truth? Do you want me to move directly into Part 7, or pause so we can outline the remaining 4 parts to see the full arc of how this horror historical saga will close? Part 7. The Fire at Moss Creek. Studio microphone, opening hook. Fire doesn't ask questions. It doesn't care who is guilty or who is innocent. It just consumes. And on that night in 1856, the fire Daniel Harrington started inside the barn at Moss Creek Plantation threatened to consume everything: secrets, sins, and lives. The question was simple. Would Harrington escape the flames, or would Moss Creek take him the way it had taken so many others before? The first flames. The ledger pages caught first, curling black in the lantern's flame. Then the hay stacked along the walls roared to life, a hungry beast devouring dry straw. Smoke filled the air. The heat grew unbearable in seconds. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't even move at first. She simply stared into the fire, her face bathed in orange light, as though watching her years of careful work dissolve in front of her eyes. Henry was different. He lunged at Harrington, seizing his arm in a crushing grip. "What have you done?" he shouted over the crackle of burning wood. Harrington fought back with every ounce of strength, coughing through the smoke. "I've given your orchard a voice," he gasped. "Now the world will hear it." The struggle. They crashed against the barn wall, fists and elbows flying. Henry's strength was greater, but Harrington's desperation gave him speed. He ducked under Henry's grip and slammed his shoulder into his chest. The 2 men stumbled into the workbench, sending tools clattering to the floor. A hammer rang out like a church bell. Sparks rained from the burning hay. Eleanor finally moved. Calmly, deliberately, she crossed to the iron box on the floor and pulled it open. Inside lay the second ledger, the true one, the one Harrington hadn't reached. She clutched it to her chest even as fire closed in. "You can burn the walls," she said evenly. "But you will not burn the truth." The collapse. The roof timbers groaned. Smoke poured upward in dark rivers. Harrington realized the barn wouldn't last long. He shoved Henry away and bolted for the door. Henry grabbed at his sleeve, tearing the fabric but missing his grip. Harrington threw his weight against the door, locked. Behind him, Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos. "You cannot run, Mr. Harrington. Moss Creek keeps what it claims." Her words were followed by a deafening crack as part of the roof caved in. Flaming wood crashed between them, splitting the barn into 2 blazing halves. Ruth's echo. Through the roar of fire, Harrington thought he heard something else. Ruth's voice, faint, echoing in his ears. Something evil happening at Moss Creek, something that needs to stop. The memory steeled him. He slammed his shoulder against the door again, harder this time. The wood splintered. With a final desperate shove, it burst open, and Harrington tumbled into the night air, gasping, coughing, choking on smoke. Behind him, the barn burned like a beacon against the dark Georgia sky. The escape, almost. Harrington stumbled across the yard, clutching his side. He could barely see through streaming eyes, but he heard it, the heavy footsteps chasing him. Henry emerged from the flames like a figure out of nightmare, his shirt scorched, his face smeared with soot, his eyes burning brighter than the fire itself. "You're not leaving," Henry growled. His voice was ragged but filled with fury. "Not alive." Harrington tried to run, but his legs buckled. Henry slammed into him, driving him into the dirt. The ledger Eleanor had carried was gone, still inside, or perhaps clutched in her hand if she had escaped another way. Harrington didn't know. All he knew was Henry's weight pressing him down, strong hands wrapping around his throat. The duel in the dirt. Harrington clawed, kicked, gasped for breath. The fire's glow cast monstrous shadows around them. Sparks drifted into the night like ghostly fireflies. Somehow, his hand found one of the tools that had spilled earlier, a small sickle used for cutting hay. He gripped it, swung blindly, and felt it connect. Henry roared in pain, releasing his grip as the blade slashed across his forearm. Blood spattered Harrington's sleeve. He scrambled free, coughing violently, dragging himself across the dirt. Henry staggered after him, wounded but relentless. Eleanor's shadow. And then she was there. Eleanor. She stepped calmly out of the smoke, her gray dress torn, her hair loose, the ledger still in her arms. Her eyes locked on Harrington, and for the first time, he saw something new in them, not just calculation but fury. "You think you've destroyed me," she said, her voice low but carrying across the yard. "But Moss Creek is older than you. Older than me. Older than everybody in that orchard. You cannot burn what is already written in blood." Her gaze shifted to Henry. "Bring him back." Henry, bleeding and enraged, obeyed. The orchard's pull. They dragged Harrington across the yard, toward the rough ground where the orchard was meant to grow. The soil smelled damp, heavy, wrong. Harrington struggled, his voice raw from smoke. "You kill me, and it ends here. Someone will know. Someone will come looking." Eleanor knelt beside him, placing the ledger gently on the ground as though it were a holy book. "No," she whispered. "If you die here, you become part of the proof. Another entry in the record. Another body in the orchard." Henry raised the hoe he had carried earlier, its blade catching the firelight. Fire-ending tease. Harrington was seconds from joining the dead men of Moss Creek. But in horror stories, survival often comes at a price, and someone at Moss Creek was about to pay it. Right finger in Part 8, the orchard opens its jaws. Blood spills on the soil that has already swallowed too many. And the truth of Moss Creek begins to break free in the most terrifying way possible. Would you like me to continue straight into Part 8, or would you prefer I outline the final 4 parts, 8 to 10, so you can see the shape of the ending before we dive deeper? Part 8. The orchard opens. Studio microphone, opening hook. They thought the orchard was silent. They thought the earth would hold its secrets forever. But on that night, with fire lighting the sky and blood spilling on the soil, Moss Creek's ground stirred. Because Earth remembers. And Earth demands. The graveyard orchard. Henry pinned Harrington in the dirt, the heavy hoe raised above his head. Eleanor stood close by, ledger clutched tight, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Do it," she said softly. "Add him to the orchard." The orchard wasn't an orchard yet. It was only a patch of uneven land behind the barn, soil dug up and filled in over and over again. To an outsider, it looked ordinary. But those who knew it was a graveyard. 13 bodies already slept beneath that earth. 13 men whose faces told the stories of powerful white families who wanted their secrets buried. And now the orchard wanted another. Harrington's plea. Henry's shadow loomed. Harrington coughed, his throat raw, his lungs burning from smoke. His eyes darted to Eleanor. "You think you're keeping records," he rasped. "You think you're proving justice. But all you've done is murder. You're no better than the men you hate." Eleanor's face didn't flinch, her lips pressed thin, her eyes like stone. "I am worse," she admitted. "Because I know what I do. And I choose it." The hoe came down, but Harrington rolled at the last second. The blade crashed into the dirt where his skull had been, sending up a shower of loose soil. And that's when the ground began to move. The soil stirs. At first it was a tremor, faint as a shiver. Then the soil around them shifted, groaned, and cracked. Harrington froze. Henry staggered back, clutching the hoe. Even Eleanor's mask slipped for a moment. The orchard was alive. The dirt rose and fell like the chest of a sleeping giant. The air filled with a smell so sharp and foul it burned their throats. Decay, old rot, graves disturbed. And then came the sound. A low, grinding moan, not from one throat but many, rising from beneath the earth. The first hand. A hand broke the surface. Pale, dirt-streaked, skin stretched tight over bone. The fingers clawed upward, reaching for air. Then another hand, and another, until the ground was crawling with them. Henry stumbled backward in horror. What is this? Eleanor did not move. Her eyes widened, but her voice stayed steady. Proof, she whispered. They will not stay buried. Harrington, still on the ground, could only stare as the dead of Moss Creek began to pull themselves free. The dead rise. One by one they emerged. 13 figures, their clothes ragged, their faces stiff with death but still recognizable. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the fire from the burning barn. They made no sound beyond the grinding of their movements. No cries, no screams, only silence, the silence of the grave. And every one of them turned their heads toward Eleanor. Eleanor's command. Eleanor stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice strong. You know why you are here, she told them. You are witnesses. You are evidence. Show him, she pointed at Harrington, show him what was done to you. Show him who your fathers were. Let the world know. But the dead did not move toward Harrington. They moved toward her. Henry's terror. Henry shouted, Mother, run. But Eleanor only lifted her chin. They will not harm me. They know I am the one who gave them voice. The dead closed in. Their movements were slow but relentless, soil falling from their limbs, bones creaking. One stretched a hand toward Eleanor's arm. Another dragged a rotted foot across the ground, pulling itself closer. Eleanor's voice wavered now. I did this for you. For all of you. You cannot. Her words broke into a scream as cold fingers wrapped around her wrist. Harrington's escape. Harrington staggered to his feet, seizing the moment. He lunged for the ledger Eleanor had dropped in her panic. The leather cover was warm, as though it had absorbed the fire's heat, but he clutched it tight to his chest. Henry saw him. No, he roared, charging forward. But one of the dead turned, intercepting Henry. Its arm hooked around his shoulders, pulling him back with unnatural strength. Henry cried out, thrashing wildly. Get off me, Mother! Eleanor tried to reach him, but more hands grabbed her, pulling her down, pinning her against the dirt. Her voice rose in fury and fear. Let me go. I gave you life again. I am the one who remembered you. But the dead did not listen. The earth claims. The ground opened like a wound. The soil that had held them swallowed back, pulling Eleanor and Henry down. Their screams echoed across the yard. Eleanor's final words rang out, torn between rage and despair. Moss Creek will never let you leave. Then the earth closed, silent again. Still, the orchard had fed. Harrington alone. The night was quiet now, except for the crackle of the burning barn. Harrington stood alone, shaking, the ledger clutched tight in his arms. His mind reeled. Had he truly seen the dead rise? Or had smoke and terror twisted his senses? But the soil told the truth. Freshly disturbed, uneven, still shifting as though something underneath had only just returned to rest. Harrington staggered away, half blind with exhaustion. He had the ledger. He had the story. But would anyone believe him? Behind him, Moss Creek loomed dark against the firelit sky, its house untouched by flame, its orchard waiting, always waiting. Fire-ending tease. The orchard had claimed its mistress and her son. But Moss Creek wasn't finished. The plantation had new secrets to keep, and Harrington wasn't free yet. Right finger in Part 9, Harrington flees into the Georgia night with the ledger in hand. But escape from Moss Creek is never simple. Because some stories don't want to be told, and some truths demand silence. Do you want me to go ahead and craft Part 9 next, or would you prefer I first outline how the last 3 parts, 8 to 10, will tie the horror arc together before I keep writing? Part 9. The Chase Through the Pines. Studio microphone opening hook. You can burn a barn. You can bury a body. But you can't outrun a curse. Daniel Harrington thought he had escaped Moss Creek with Eleanor's ledger in hand. But the night had other plans. And the Georgia pines are no friend to a hunted man. Fleeing the fire, smoke trailed behind Harrington as he stumbled away from the plantation house. His lungs burned, his clothes stank of ash, and his hands clutched the ledger so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He didn't look back at the orchard. He didn't want to see if the soil moved again. He didn't want to see if Eleanor's pale hand clawed its way back up. All he wanted was distance. Distance and breath. He cut across the cotton fields, then into the line of pines beyond. Their branches tangled overhead, blotting out the moon. The deeper he went, the darker it became. But behind him, he swore he heard something following. The sound of pursuit. At first it was faint. The crunch of soil, the drag of a heavy foot. He told himself it was his imagination, or maybe the sound of his own ragged steps echoing in the quiet night. Then he heard it again. Louder. Closer. Not just one set of steps. Many. Harrington stopped, pressing his back against a tree, straining to listen. The pines whispered with wind. Owls called in the distance. But beneath it all came the steady, grinding sound of movement. The orchard had not stayed buried. Ruth's warning. Ruth's words echoed in his memory. Something evil happening at Moss Creek, something that needs to stop. Had the orchard claimed her too? Was she still alive back at the house? He couldn't know. All he knew was that the dead Eleanor had disturbed were not content to rest. And now they were walking. Toward him. The shape in the trees. Through the shifting shadows, he saw them. Figures between the pines, their outlines blurred by darkness, their movements slow but unstoppable. Their eyes caught the faintest light, gray and empty, reflecting moon and flame. Harrington clutched the ledger tighter. No, he whispered. Your evidence. Your proof. Not my executioners. But the orchard didn't care about justice. The orchard cared about silence. A desperate run. He broke into a run, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at his face and coat. The ledger thumped against his chest with every stride. Behind him, the dead moved faster now. Still awkward, still stiff, but driven by something stronger than muscle. Hunger, maybe, rage, or Eleanor's final command echoing in their bones. Moss Creek will never let you leave. Harrington tripped on a root and fell hard, his palms scraping raw against the earth. The ledger tumbled from his grip. When he looked up, one of them was there, only 10 paces away. Its face was half decayed, but enough remained for Harrington to see the resemblance. The Rutledge nose. The Caldwell eyes. Eleanor's words came back to him. They are evidence. But evidence didn't stagger through the woods reaching out with clawed fingers. Evidence didn't moan in voices that sounded like the grave itself. He snatched the ledger and ran again. The creek crossing. Ahead, he heard water rushing. A creek cut through the woods, shallow but fast. If he crossed, maybe the current would hide his trail. He splashed into the water, the cold shocking his body awake. The current tugged at his legs as he stumbled across. Behind him, the figures reached the bank. For one horrifying moment, he thought they would stop, that water might bar them. Then the first one stepped in. Then the second. The dead did not fear the creek. They waded through, slow but relentless, soil washing from their clothes into the water. Harrington forced himself up the opposite bank, gasping, shaking, barely holding onto the ledger. A flicker of hope. Through the trees ahead, he saw light. Not fire this time, but a lantern. A wagon sat on the road, a mule tied to its hitch. A man stood beside it, adjusting something in the wagon bed. A traveler. A chance. Help, Harrington shouted, his voice ragged. For God's sake, help me. The man turned, startled. He was a farmer by the look of him, broad-shouldered, clothes plain and dusty from the road. He raised his lantern high, peering into the trees. What's the matter with you? He called. Harrington staggered forward, clutching the ledger like salvation. They're coming. The dead, they're coming. The farmer frowned. You drunk, mister. And then the farmer saw them. The farmer's horror. Shapes emerging from the pines. 13 figures, faces slack with death, clothes hanging in tatters. Their eyes caught the lantern light, glowing faint. The farmer's jaw dropped. Lord preserve us. He grabbed Harrington by the arm and hauled him toward the wagon. Get in, now. They scrambled onto the wagon seat as the farmer whipped the reins hard. The mule brayed and lurched forward, hoofs pounding the dirt road. Behind them, the dead reached the edge of the trees. They did not run, but they did not stop either. Their gray faces turned, following the wagon as though marking its direction. And then, one by one, they stepped back into the shadows, vanishing into the night. Harrington's resolve. Harrington collapsed against the wagon seat, soaked, bleeding, trembling. The ledger lay heavy in his lap. The farmer glanced at him, eyes wide. What in God's name was that? Harrington swallowed hard. His voice was low, but steady now. That, he said, was Moss Creek. And the world will know about it. But even as he spoke, part of him knew the truth. The orchard had let him go tonight, but Moss Creek wasn't finished. The dead were patient. The dead could wait. Fire-ending tease. Daniel Harrington had escaped the plantation, for now. But carrying Moss Creek's secrets was dangerous, and the ledger in his lap was more curse than gift. Right finger in Part 10, the final chapter, Harrington brings the story north. But Moss Creek doesn't like being told, and some stories fight back. The question is simple: will Moss Creek's truth ever see the light of day? Would you like me to now draft the final Part 10 straight away, or would you like me to first outline how the ending could go, whether Harrington exposes Moss Creek or whether the curse silences him forever? Part 10. The Ledger's Curse. Studio microphone opening hook. Some stories end with justice. Others end with silence. But the story of Moss Creek, it ends with a warning. Carrying the ledger north, Daniel Harrington never set foot on Georgia soil again. After that night, after the figures in the pines, he rode north with the farmer's wagon until he reached the train lines in Atlanta. From there, he carried Eleanor's ledger back to Boston, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath his coat as though the dead might still reach for it. In Boston, he presented it to fellow abolitionists. The coded pages, the descriptions, the careful notes about skin, eyes, jawlines, it was all there. At first, his colleagues believed he had struck gold. This, one said, flipping through the pages, is proof. Not just of cruelty, but of the hypocrisy at the very heart of the South. With this, we could ruin families, shake their foundations, turn public opinion. But as they studied the ledger, something strange began to happen. The ledger speaks. Men who read too long complained of whispers. Women who touched the pages said they smelled soil, wet soil, like something freshly turned. One young lawyer who tried to decode Eleanor's cipher woke in the night screaming about faces watching him from the shadows of his room. The ledger didn't want to be read. It wanted to be obeyed. And worse, its words seemed to shift. Sometimes names appeared where none had been before. Sometimes descriptions lengthened, details so vivid they read like autopsies. Harrington swore he never wrote those words, but the ink was his. The ledger had taken his hand. Harrington's decline. Harrington changed after Moss Creek. He stopped attending public meetings. He avoided the courthouse. His colleagues whispered that the haunted look in his eyes had only grown deeper. By 1859, he was drinking heavily. By 1860, he had withdrawn almost entirely, clutching the ledger like it was his child. One night, he told a friend, "It isn't just a record. It's alive. Eleanor may be gone, but her purpose remains. Moss Creek won't rest until its story is told, and once it's told, it won't rest until it claims more." The friend dismissed it as drunken madness. But Harrington wasn't drunk when he vanished. Disappearance in 1861. In March of 1861, as the nation braced for war, Daniel Harrington disappeared from his Boston boarding house. His room was locked from the inside. His bed unslept in. His belongings untouched. Only the ledger remained, lying open on the desk, its ink wet, the last line written in a hurried scrawl. "They are here." The ledger's journey. The ledger passed from hand to hand after Harrington's disappearance. Some tried to decode it, others tried to destroy it. One abolitionist threw it into a fire, but the flames refused to blacken the pages. Another locked it in a chest and sank it into Boston Harbor, but fishermen swore they saw it floating days later, washed ashore with the ink clearer than ever. During the Civil War, Union soldiers carried it south as evidence of Southern sin. Some said those who carried it met violent ends in battle. Others said they saw Eleanor herself in the smoke of burning plantations, smiling the tight smile, the one that never reached her eyes. After the war, the ledger vanished again. Some claimed it was buried in the ruins of Atlanta. Others whispered it was sealed in a Harvard archive, hidden away with documents too dangerous to release. Moss Creek after the war. And what of Moss Creek itself? The plantation house burned during Sherman's march, its timbers collapsing into ash. The orchard land remained untouched. No one dared plow it, not even after emancipation. Local freedmen avoided the area entirely, swearing they heard voices at night, voices calling from beneath the earth. Children dared one another to walk into the orchard after dark. Some came back pale and silent. Others never came back at all. By the 1880s, Moss Creek was abandoned. Locals called it cursed ground. The county refused to sell the land, no matter the offer. And yet, late travelers on the road to Augusta swore they saw lantern light moving through the fields, a widow in gray walking with a tall man by her side. Eleanor and Henry, still planning, still watching. The final sightings. The last documented sighting came in 1887. A surveyor mapping property lines near the Oconee River reported seeing rows of figures standing silently among the trees at dusk. He thought at first they were scarecrows. Then one turned its head. The surveyor abandoned his post that night, refusing to ever return. His report ended with one line written in a shaky hand. The orchard is not empty. The story that refuses to die. So what became of Moss Creek's ledger? Some say it lies in a locked archive in Washington, sealed away by men who knew its influence was too dangerous. Others whisper it surfaces from time to time, an estate sale, an antique shop, a forgotten attic, always finding its way back into curious hands. And maybe you don't need the ledger at all. Maybe the story itself is enough. Maybe every time someone speaks Eleanor's name, every time the tale of Moss Creek is told, the soil in that orchard shifts just a little. Some secrets, after all, refuse to stay buried. Closing words. That concludes the story of Eleanor Cresswell, her son Henry, and Moss Creek, the plantation that became a tomb for both bodies and reputations. But now I want to hear from you. Was Eleanor a monster, or was she a twisted kind of avenger, striking back at the system that destroyed her life? Do you believe Moss Creek was cursed, or was it simply haunted by the sins of slavery itself? Drop your theories in the comments below. And if this series kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this remind us that history isn't just in books. Sometimes, it's in the ground beneath our feet. And sometimes, it's still watching us. Fire, series end.